Hello, everyone. Dr. Stillman here. And today we are going to be talking about why Dr. Stillman doesn't like living in densely populated urban areas where there's problems with flooding. In addition to rural areas where there's problems with flooding, I like to be high and dry. Okay. And we're going to talk about why, because it's really important for people's health, their well-being, to understand how this can really derail their good health and set them up for failure. And this is all inspired by an article from zerohedge.com, which I love reading. And part of why I read it is they have such a really wide variety of stories on here. And this story is about major flooding in Miami after tropical weather dumps heavy rain. Now, practically everywhere in the United States can get a big enough dump of rain or snowfall runoff for there to be some amount of flooding. Flooding in modern buildings is a major, major issue because buildings are not being built to be flood resistant. They're being built to be energy efficient. What that means is that if your house is damaged by water, that water can, because the houses are airtight, thanks to our drive for better energy efficiency, right? Less ventilation with air passing in and out of windows, doors, door jambs, et cetera, really tight HVAC systems where the air is constantly being recirculated within the home. You can get extremely high levels of indoor air pollutants. That's not that big of a deal. It's not a 0%, it's not a non-issue, but it's not as big of a deal when the house is nice and high and dry. Remember, though, that it's not just about flooding from the environment, it's about also potentially leaks within the house. That's why I really don't like the idea of skimping on building materials. Something as simple as like whether or not you use a plastic PEX pipe to hook up your washing machine, as opposed to something more robust like a brass or stainless steel, like a metal pipe. That can make a difference because that PEX pipe is much more prone to breakdown or damage due to something like an errant nail coming through a piece of drywall. And you can wind up with a big time water damage in your home, your office, wherever. Again, why is flooding more of an issue now in urban areas than before? This has to do with understanding how urban areas are built. People don't like living on swamps. Swamps are where you find all kinds of different pests, notably in North America, mosquitoes. Mosquitoes have really exploded in their prevalence in a lot of ways because we used to control them with pesticides. We obviously stopped doing that because we figured out the pesticides were bad for people, but we didn't come up with an alternative control approach. If you go back into the history of malaria as a disease, it's fascinating what extremes we went to in order to eliminate malaria in the United States by cutting down on mosquito populations. Those mosquito populations have bounced back, but they don't carry malaria because we eradicated it effectively from the populace thanks to a lot of different efforts. It's actually one of the public health feats of the 20th century is the eradication, 19th to 20th centuries, the eradication, virtually speaking, of malaria from Europe and North America. In North America, it was as far north, if I recall correctly, as like the Virginias and the Carolinas. And in Europe, it was as far north as Denmark because of how warm it would be in Denmark during the summer season. We've paved over a lot of area in urban areas. So Miami-Dade County is a great example of this. It's incredibly built up. Now, before water reclamation acts were passed in the 1960s and 70s, prohibiting people from just destroying swampland en masse, we had lots and lots of swampland. That swampland soaks up water when it rains so that it doesn't flood over. This is why if you go to newer developments, you'll notice they've been fit into the landscape around these big wetlands. And people say, oh, these wetlands, they smell bad. There's mosquitoes. There may be other pests or critters. They make my commute another 20, 30 minutes from the house. I can't, it's roundabout because I have to go over some road that it takes the only way out of the swamp. All of that's very inconvenient. But the reality is that when you wildly develop a place like they've done in places like Miami, New York, when a huge torrential rainfall shows up, it overwhelms the city's system for handling it. This creates a bunch of different problems. One of them is mold damage to buildings. Mold damage to cars is relevant, but most of the time when that happens, the car, if it's substantial water damage, the car is totaled. If it's not, you can air it out and you can renovate it, things like that pretty easily because a car is a lot smaller and less complicated than a house. Sometimes this will cause the sewage system of the city to overflow, which can really smell bad. You may not realize you're living in a place where that happens. Then all of a sudden, for a week after a big rainfall, you're living in a place that smells like an open sewer. That tends to scale with the cost of the home. It's one of those things to watch for if you're getting a real steal or a real deal on something. That person wants to sell for a reason. Never, ever, ever assume that reason is not air, water, light, or sound pollution, because that can play a huge role in bad homes that make you sick. I do a lot of work with that in my practice. That's why I talk about it so much. So let's talk a little bit more about mold damaged buildings, the science behind this, and the realities of it, because there's so much out there on this. It's very confusing to patients. So first of all, this is a thing that everyone agrees exists. Even these guys, who I'm not fans of, understand that high quantities of mold and so on in buildings creates significant health problems. Why? Why is this? It's because of the toxins being produced by these molds. It's because of the spores being produced by these molds. It's just about the amount of sometimes sheer quantity of particulate and pollutant matter in the air. I had a friend call me one night freaking out because he'd had an air quality inspection done of his home, and some of his family members had recently become sick, and they found off the charts levels of particulate matter. And what was happening is their house had been eaten away significantly by mold that they didn't realize had gotten into the house because of a pool of standing water in the crawl space under the home. And it's not the first time I've heard a story like that. What happens when these levels of pollutants accumulate in the air is diseases of the organ systems that are exposed to them. Respiratory symptoms, ear, nose, throat, lungs, problems with asthma, particularly if it's getting worse or is difficult to treat. Hypersensitivity pneumonitis is very rare. And hopefully, if you have this and you go to a doctor, they're going to ask you the right questions to figure out that this is what's going on. Because if you eliminate the allergen, this otherwise very crippling, very severe disease can be really terrible. Respiratory infections, allergic rhinitis, bronchitis, eczema, a skin condition. When I see any of these in the clinical picture, I start to ask questions about how long have you lived in the home? Is everybody healthy? Does anybody notice symptoms are better or worse when they go on vacation? What kind of vacation? What are you doing during the vacation? Are you outside? Are you in the sun? Are you indoors? All these questions are how I sort of try and figure out, okay, is the patient being poisoned by their house, which happens more often than I would like it to. Notice exposures in damp buildings are complex. I could not agree with this statement more. Okay, they vary from building to building and in different places within a building. They can also vary within different time frames. Okay, so does the patient have the same symptoms in the morning? Do they have them at night? Do they have them during the summer when they may open the windows for ventilation? Do they have them in the summer when the air conditioning is on, which may be distinct from the heating unit of the house? Do they have it in the winter when the heating unit is on? Do they have it in the winter when they're opening the windows because it's nice and cool outside because they live in a place like Florida? These are all things that have to be taken into account in order to really understand why is the patient sick and is the building making them sick? Sick building syndrome and exposure to water damaged buildings. This is an interesting study, one of the only ones done like it, because for those of you who don't know, there's this really interesting disinterest in academia in this clinical entity. Sick building syndrome is not something controversial. Well, it is, but its existence is not controversial. I have the Washington Manual of Allergy and Immunology in my library, and there's an entire chapter on sick building syndrome about this exact pathology, and it counsels and cautions doctors to ask patients about their symptoms in a building and to remember that their symptoms can always be due to problems with the air quality in that building. Despite having spent an abundance of time with allergists, pulmonologists, ENTs, many different people whose diseases and specialties concern the human airway, there is a remarkable lack of interest in and lack of actual attention in clinical time to figuring out if the patient's being poisoned by their building. I would submit to you that this may well be because no one gets paid to cure patients in conventional medical model based on insurance billing. They get paid to treat patients. So the longer you treat the patient and the more you treat the patient, the more money you're going to make, which is why I don't work for your insurance company. Thanks for asking. I'm not interested in enrolling with them. So why does this get complex? Okay, indoor air of water damaged buildings, that's WDBs, often contains a complex mixture of fungi, mycotoxins, bacteria, endotoxins, antigens, lipopolysaccharides, and biologically produced volatile compounds. In other words, a very large mix of things. Sometimes people will fall into the trap of thinking, well, there's no mold spores in my air. I don't care that there's no mold spores in your air. What is your particulate matter count? What are your VOC levels? There are very affordable air monitoring devices, anywhere from 50 to 200 bucks, that can tell you all that. Or you can have someone come to your home and actually inspect it, which I really think is wise on a periodic basis. And only once you've quantified that can you determine, okay, here's the source of the air pollution. Because remember, it's not just mold in your building that can poison you. It could be chemicals off-gassing from anything from furniture to books to carpet. If someone installs new carpet in their home and comes to me and says someone is sick in the house, I say, can you smell the carpet when you left the house for a period of hours and you're no longer nose blind to it? Do you smell it when you walk through the door? And then how quickly can you air the place out? Because there's nothing you can do once the carpet's in, short of ripping it up again, to get rid of all that toxic, chemical, other than airing the house out and letting the air dilute it, and then get rid of it. But I digress. So there's all these different things in the air of a water damaged building that can be making you sick. It's not just one, it's not just two, it's not just a single chemical species we can easily test for. It's also why I'm not really a fan of testing people for mycotoxins. I don't need to know if they have mycotoxins. I need to know if they live in a healthy house. If you feel better outside of your house, that's a huge red flag. And I don't know if it's mycotoxins or if it's, cat dander from the last owner of your house, or if it's the VOCs that are coming out of your carpets in trace amounts. I have no idea. It could be any of a really extremely wide variety of things. This is why one of my favorite diagnostic tests is not really a test, is for someone to take a camping vacation for a week, because it gets them away from all of their technology, all their EMFs, all their sources of indoor air pollution in their home. It gets them away from their water source, if that's a potential issue, like a well. I've seen those poison people. And then it tells us, do they feel better in nature? Because they may just have what I like to call nature deficiency. What are the effects of all this? Very broad range of effects. And this is one of the only papers on this. It talks about actual laboratory data in a group of people. I think it's about 209 patients, adults, middle-aged, but with a pretty broad range here, 14 up to 60s and 70s, and 14 down to 20s. The mold-exposed patients reported a greater frequency and intensity of symptoms, particularly neurological and inflammatory, when compared with controls. The percentages of exposed individuals with increased lymphocyte phenotypes were, I'm not going to bore you with those numbers. What that means is that there are some changes to the immune system's balance in these folks. I don't think it's really clear. I think it's about as clear as mud exactly what those changes are. The effect is there. Mitogenesis. Mitogenesis means the stimulation of immune cells based on certain toxins. The two that we use most frequently are phytohemagglutinin and concanavalin A. What they're saying here is that a significant proportion of the people who were mold exposed, their immune system responded differently than the controls. And again, that's not necessarily confirmation that there's a clinical disease going on here, but it's an indication that there's a biological effect unique to having been exposed to a mold damaged building that is underappreciated, I believe, in the conventional medical world, where no one's asking these questions in the amount of time and detail that it really takes in order to understand if this is a component of the patient's illness. Anyway, here's the real kicker though. Abnormally high levels of ANA, ASM, and CNS myelin and PNS myelin were found. Odds ratios for each were significant, and 95% confidence intervals showing an increased risk for autoimmunity. These are markers of autoimmunity or reaction of the body's immune system against components of the body itself. This is a confused immune system. Frequently, it's a weak immune system. These people have a higher incidence of certain spontaneous infections. They have a higher mortality. Long-term, they have less good and robust health. You can't treat any of these things with a single agent. You can support the body to try and restore normal immunity so it doesn't try and kill your own tissues. But that doesn't always do the people who've been damaged by a mold damaged building and the toxicity associated with it any good once the harm has already been done. So the name of the game is not living in a mold damaged building. And whenever someone tells me that they and everyone living in a dwelling place with them is having new health problems and is sick, I am very, very keen to talk to them about the air quality, the odors, the smells, how much time they spend there, where they're sleeping, when the last time they took a vacation was, how they felt while they were on vacation, where they went, what they did, what they're doing that may change or alter the effects of these toxicities. For example, if a wife comes in with a child, the child has eczema, the wife's got new allergic rhinitis and headaches, the husband's a traveling salesman who's only home 2 out of every 7 days of a week, I don't expect him to be sick. And if he's well and mom and baby are sick or child are sick, that suggests that their increased exposure at home, let's say they're homeschooled or at least are home, 16, 20 hours a day, that's a very different exposure than the guy who's traveling all the time. All these are little clues you pick up on as you take histories from these patients to try and figure out what's really making them sick. Molds and mycotoxins. There's a lot of people out there saying, oh, well, there's, let's say you have mold behind a wall, okay? And it's not getting into the duct system that you know of. That's all well and good, but if there's mold in the house, there can be, and there's documented to be, significant levels potentially of things like mycotoxins in the air. Now, what does that mean? A mycotoxin is a toxins produced by a mold. There's a reason molds produce toxins. There's a reason why you don't just go ahead and eat the moldy bread that you've left in the refrigerator or in the bread box for too long. You know that mold can poison you. Very few molds in nature are benign. We call these food. They are things like Brettanomyces or Saccharomyces cerevisiae or Saccharomyces boulardii. These are actually potentially, arguably, probiotics that can be used that way. And they're actually present in a lot of our foods. Brewer's yeast, if memory serves, is Brettanomyces, and baker's yeast is Saccharomyces cerevisiae. So you're exposed to these all the time, but they don't produce toxins that kill you, okay? Other molds do. They produce these toxins because they can't move. Because they can't move, everything that walks on 2 or 4 legs wants to eat them because they're great protein sources. So if they don't produce toxins, they've got a bad chance of being eaten, and that's not, life's goal. This is why mushroom foraging is so hazardous. The mushrooms also produce these toxins. And this makes a lot of things that move on 2 and 4 legs think twice about eating mold or eating mushrooms, right? Poisonous mushrooms still kill people every year because mushroom foragers will make the mistake of thinking that a mushroom that's edible and non-toxic is actually, they'll think it's an edible, non-toxic mushroom when in fact it's a very poisonous mushroom. In this study, they looked at house dust and other materials from mold damaged buildings, and they found that a substantial proportion of these buildings actually have 66% of the analyzed building material samples, 11% of the settled dust samples, and 51% of the cultured dust samples were positive for at least one of the studied mycotoxins. Those are toxins from the molds, leading us to conclude that if you have a significantly mold damaged building and there is any penetration of that material into the air, however that may happen, it could be making people in the building sick. And this is why mold damaged buildings are a really big deal. That's why there's lots of people flying around the country, flying around the world, spending money on their health, confused as to why they're sick, and then going home at night or going home at the end of their medical tourism travels to the same house that's making them sick, wasting money on supplements, wasting money on lifestyle hacks, wasting money on everything from sauna to ozone to enemas to, the list goes on and on and on, all because nobody bothered to talk to them about how their house may, or office, or other place they spend a lot of time may be poisoning them. So as always, to apply for consultation, go to stillmanmd.com and hit the apply for consultation tab. I am taking new patients. As always, make sure you check out my Telegram and Substack blogs where more helpful insight and content is always coming out. Check out my YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, all the rest of the social media places where I am, but a lot of my less controversial material is going to be because of obvious reasons. As always, thanks for watching. Have a great day. If this video has been helpful to you, make sure that you check out my link tree below to find out how you can keep in touch with me best. And if you would like to become a patient at my practice, please apply to work with me at stillmanmd.com. Thank you again for watching. Have a great day.